Okay, so we're going to begin Chapter 4, which is our first body system. It's the integumentary system. The integumentary system consists of our skin, hair, oil, sweat glands, nails, and the sensory receptors, which are associated with these structures. So let's begin with our skin. It's also known as the cutaneous membrane, as we were introduced to in Chapter 3. There's a subcutaneous layer, which is found under the two layers that compose the skin. That subcutaneous layer contains areolar and adipose connective tissues. It's basically for the storage depot for storing various substances such as fat and other nutrients for our skin. The dermis is attached directly to that layer, and it's anchored to the underlying tissues and organs. The two layers of the skin consist of the dermis and the epidermis. So the dermis is superficial to the subcutaneous layer, and then the epidermis is superficial to the dermis layer. The epidermis is the most superficial layer. It's epithelial tissue, and the dermis is a deeper layer, which is connective tissue. Here you can see what I was talking about down here with all of these yellow blobs. Those are the fat cells that make up the subcutaneous layer, which is also sometimes called the hypodermis. That's the site of hypodermic injections. Then you have the dermis layer here. It's all connective tissue. You can see some accessory structures in here, the hair follicles, various glandular structures dipping down into the dermis. There's also special sense receptors. This is a Pacinian corpuscle for deep touch. And then all of that is, of course, covered by the epidermis, which is what you see when you look at your skin, and the hairs project through the pores onto the epidermal surface. So let's talk about the basic structure of the epidermis. It's composed of a special type of cell called a keratinocyte. They're keratinized stratified squamous. So it's a stratified squamous, meaning that these are flattened cells in several layers, and these cells have become what we call keratinized, which basically means they're kind of hardened and dehydrated. If you think about the cells of your outer skin and compare that to like the cells of the inner linings of your cheeks, the cells in the inner linings of your cheeks are very moist and fluffy. They secrete lots of mucus, whereas your skin is rather dry and rough compared to the insides of your cheeks. That's because of the keratin that is built up inside of those cells. So the main type of cell making up our epidermis are the keratinocytes. There's also melanocytes. Those secrete the pigment melanin. There's Langerhans cells, which help support the immune system, and Merkel cells, which help with the sense reception. So on most of our body, there are 4 layers of the epidermis. This is called thin skin. The skin on your arms, the skin on your legs, the skin on your face is all just 4 layers thick. It's called thin skin. Thick skin is on our hairless skin that's on the palms of our hands and soles of our feet. There's an extra layer on these parts of our body to give it a thicker, more hardened characteristic. The 5 layers, starting with the deepest layer, are the Stratum Basale, the Stratum Spinosum, Stratum Granulosum. The Stratum Lucidum is only in those thick skin areas, and the very top layer of the layer that you see is called the Stratum Corneum. That's the most superficial layer. Here you can see the picture. At the top of your screen here, you see your Stratum Corneum. These are the cells that are sloughing off, that collect all around your house in the form of dust. Then you have the Stratum Lucidum, only on the thick skin, Stratum Granulosum, and the Stratum Spinosum. The cells in the Stratum Spinosum kind of look spiny because of the buildup of all of that keratin inside of them. Keratin is the protein that accumulates in these cells. Here you can see a special Langerhans cell. Here's a special Merkel cell. And the very bottom layer of this epidermis is called the Stratum Basale. This Stratum Basale is rooted in that basement membrane, this little blue layer that connects the epidermis to the dermis. The Stratum Basale is literally just a single row of cuboidal or sometimes columnar keratinocytes. These are basically stem cells that are going to undergo rapid mitosis to produce new keratinocytes. If we flip back here for a minute, you'll see that this cell, for example, is undergoing mitosis. Looks like it's in anaphase there, going through a cell division to create new cells which will then proliferate through the epidermal layers. The next layer up from the stratum basale is the stratum spinosum. This is roughly 8 to 10 layers thick. They're densely packed together. This is providing strength and flexibility. In the more superficial layers of the stratum spinosum, the keratinocytes are beginning to flatten. This is also where the keratin protein begins to build up inside of these living cells. Within the stratum granulosum, there's actually more keratin protein in these cells than there is living tissue. These are cells that are beginning to die because they're so overfilled with this keratin protein they can no longer support their own life. So that's why they look very grainy in this layer, hence the term stratum granulosum. These cells are mostly flattened, and there's only about 3 to 5 cell layers within the stratum granulosum. Moving up through our epidermis, we get to the stratum lucidum, again, only in areas that's exposed to high friction, like the palms of our hands, soles of our feet, and fingertips. There's somewhere between 3 to 5 layers here. These cells are clear, they're dead, the keratin has been basically taken over the inside of these cells, and so they're no longer living. That leads us to the stratum corneum, which is the thickest cell layer, 25 to 30 layers thick. These are all dead keratinocytes, so dead cells again. The interior of the cells is mostly keratin. As I've mentioned, that keratin just builds up in that stratum granulosum layer. And by the time the cells reach the stratum corneum, they're basically filled with keratin and have no other substances inside of them, no water, etc. There's several layers of these dead cells, ultimately to serve the purpose for protection. The keratinocytes were formed from the basal layer, and they're basically pushed up through the other layers as mitosis occurs within that basal layer. As those keratinocytes move through the layers, more keratin is acquired. It's called the process of keratinization, and those keratinocytes are sloughed off just about every 4 weeks or so. Is about how long it takes for those keratinocytes to slough off once they reach the stratum corneum. And as they slough off, that again makes the majority of the dust that you find around your house or accumulates in mattress pads and pillowcases, etc. Kind of a gross concept to think about. Below the dermis, or below the epidermis, I should say, is the dermis. This is our connective tissue layers. It's mostly collagen and elastic fibers that give our dermis some flexibility. This is why you can pinch your skin and then it goes right back to where it was. It's because of those collagen and elastic fibers that allow for that rebound effect. There are 2 layers to the dermis. There's the papillary region, which is the more superficial region. This is the layer that connects with the epidermis, and then the deeper reticular region connects with the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer, which is where all the adipose tissue is. The papillary region, or more superficial region of the dermis, is only about 1/5 of the dermis itself, so it's the smaller of the 2 regions. It's mostly filled with areolar connective tissue, lots of elastic fibers. There are dermal papillae within the dermis. These are kind of projections that go into the undersurface of the epithelial layer, kind of like the egg crate mattresses that you would use to go camping on. They kind of form little grooves interlocking the superficial surface of the dermis with the deep layer of the epithelium. There's some blood capillaries in this area, as well as some nerve endings, some corpuscles for touch reception, as well as pain and itching sensations are all within this papillary region as well. The deeper reticular region of the dermis is attached to the subcutaneous layer. There's lots of dense, irregular connective tissue within this layer, as well as adipose cells. Hair follicles go into the reticular region. Oil glands and sweat glands all dip down into the reticular region as well. There's lots of strength and elasticity given to our epidermis because of the special dense, irregular connective tissue within this layer. Our skin color is produced by a ratio of various pigments. The 3 major pigment molecules in our skin are melanin, hemoglobin, and keratin. So let's talk about melanin first. Melanin is kind of a pale yellow to a black color, so it's somewhere in that spectrum. It absorbs UV light. The melanocytes are the pigment-producing cells. These are the special cells that produce melanin. They're found in that stratum basale, as well as within mucous membranes like the linings of our mouth and nasal passageways. They're most plentiful on areas that have high sensitivity, like the nipples, parts of the face, parts of our limbs. And the difference in skin color is due to the amount of pigment within the melanocytes, not the number of melanocytes. Most people have generally the same amount of melanocytes. What makes some people's skin darker than others is rather the amount of melanin that is produced, not the number of melanocytes. Albinism is a condition where no melanin is produced, so there's no melanin in the skin, no melanin in the hair, or the eye pigmentation does not occur either because there's a lack of melanin. Freckles are an accumulation of melanin in patches throughout the body. Age spots is where the melanin will accumulate with age and form flat blemishes that range in color from light brown to black. A mole, or a nevus, is the technical term for mole. It's a round, flat, can also be a raised area. It's a benign overgrowth of melanocytes, and they can develop in childhood or adolescence for the most part. Vitiligo is the opposite condition. This is where the melanocytes are partially or completely lost from areas of the skin. So this would produce irregular white spots. It could be potentially caused by an autoimmune disorder. Continuing with melanin, superficial to the nucleus in the keratinocyte, it's going to help block radiation from damaging the DNA, specifically ultraviolet radiation. That sun causes lots of damage. We know that sun causes damage to the skin, but what it's actually doing is damaging the DNA within those keratinocytes. Melanin levels change with the changing levels of sun exposure. You know that because I'm sure at some point in time you've been tanned or maybe even burned by the sun. That's because the melanin is accumulating in response to the UV exposure. That UV light is going to stimulate melanin production and melanin deposition within the keratinocytes. So fading tan due to melanin-containing keratinocytes as they're being shed from the stratum corneum is when your tan begins to fade. Excessive UV radiation can actually override the effects of melanin and still cause skin cancer, which is why it's important to always protect yourself from the sun or avoid direct UV light exposure. Hemoglobin is another pigment-causing protein. It's actually an oxygen-carrying pigment within our red blood cells. Since the lighter pigmented skin has less melanin, hemoglobin is actually going to have a larger role in determining the degree of reddish hue within the skin. For the most part, our skin is translucent. That reddish hue is determined by the oxygen content of the blood through the epidermis capillaries. You know that if you've ever cut off your blood circulation, maybe you put a rubber band around your hand or finger and it turns a bluish color. That's because of the lack of hemoglobin in that area. Hemoglobin is going to give your skin that kind of pinky color or pinky glow. Carotene is another pigment. It's a yellow-orange pigment as opposed to a yellow-black pigment, melanin. It's found in egg yolks and carrots as well as some leafy green vegetables. It's actually a precursor for vitamin A, which plays a huge role in eyesight. It's going to accumulate within the stratum corneum and within the fatty layers of the dermis and the subcutaneous layer. If there's an excess dietary intake of vitamin A, that's where carotene is stored because it's a fat-soluble vitamin. The excess pigmentation in light-skinned individuals can actually be seen as an orange hue. If you've ever gone through a period in your life where you just love carrots, for instance, and you eat so many carrots within a given period, your skin will actually turn an orangish color, and that's because of the accumulation of carotene. It will be mostly expressed in the palms of your hands and soles of your feet, but your skin will have an orangish hue if you eat too much carotene. We'll stop here for part 1.